Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Brittany.
So today, I want to talk a little bit about TikTok and how the clock is ticking for TikTok. I thought that was really cute. I made that up before.
That is very cute.
So
TikTok.
this episode is filming in the middle of January. But by the time this airs, the ban that Congress passed banning TikTok, or the law, that will be either in effect or something else will have happened. And there are a million different ways this could play out. My prediction is, so right now, both the people, trying to ban it and the people who think there's a case to be made for why it's unconstitutional for it to be banned are kind of butting heads. And there's some lawsuits that are probably going to get brought forward here pretty soon. And
so I'm confused. Yep. Can we first start with, because I'm not much of a TikTok user. Mm-hmm. I don't spend a lot of time on TikTok at all. I have an account, but I don't use it. Is the law really requiring that it be banned or sold from the Chinese company that owns it? Can you give me an overview of what's really going on and why?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So the why, I'll save the why for a little bit after this. So basically the law says that for national security reasons, and I'll get into that in a minute, that TikTok is either going to be banned in the United States or the Chinese company that owns it needs to be sold to an American company to run it. Now, that doesn't mean
Elon Musk might buy it.
I heard Elon Musk. That's a rumor today, January 16th. So I don't know what's going to happen with that.
See what happens.
Now, TikTok is in many countries. So this would just be for the American platform because I believe it's, we're the only country doing this. Now, you asked why, and I want to get into these specifics because this is going to help us understand why some people are against it and some people are for it, and why both might actually have some good points. So, I can see both sides. I'm not really sure yet.
I actually can too, but let's proceed.
It's interesting. So why they want to ban it. There are some very real national security reasons why TikTok poses a problem. So private companies, when you use their apps, we know Google does this, even Apple does this sometimes, they collect your data, right? They collect a lot of very personal data. But Rachel, if Google does it, at least we know it's a private company. I'm not saying that makes it good, but at least we know it's a private company and not
it's an American company.
That it's an American company, but that to me is more or less important that it's not the government invading our privacy, right? Because with Google, I opted in. I have a Google Home. In fact, I got to stop saying Google Home. I'm looking at my Google Home or it's going to start going off. But so I made the decision to put that in my home and to collect all this information. And whether or not people think that's silly of me or not, I made that decision, right? So
hey, Wiretap, can you give me a recipe for pancakes?
Exactly. But you know what? It makes my life a little easier. But so they have the right to do that because I opted in. The government does not have the right to abuse my privacy, right? And that's one of the coolest parts about our Constitution. But China doesn't have that policy. Okay, so in China, it's a communist country. So there's really no such thing as a private company. TikTok might be a private company in China, but because the government owns everything because of communism, all they have to say is, I want that data. You got that data from Americans. We want it. We want to see it. And that is scary. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, Rachel, but I do feel like that is a little bit scary.
It is. And what are they going to use the data for? I mean, can you imagine?
No.
Yeah. And also, I've heard the algorithm feeds different things to American kids than it feeds to, like, say, Chinese kids. Like Chinese kids, the algorithm will send them like math lessons and things about science and stuff like that. And then for American kids, it feeds them like brain rotting garbage.
Yeah.
Which would be one way to, if you wanted to destroy the next generation of your financial adversary, that might be one way you could go about it.
But, on that note, and I'm going to get on to now why I think there's some good things for it. I use TikTok to learn, and I learn so much on TikTok. I really do. I learned so much on it. I've learned how to do like plumbing. I learned how to change like a shower head and a faucet, and I'm not a plumber. So I've learned all these things. I've learned about history. I've learned recipes. That's how I really got started with my bread making. So I've learned a lot from TikTok. And because my algorithm, that code that shows me things that I like, because it knows what I like, it only shows me those things. I don't get like silly dancing videos. In fact, I've never really seen those on my my For You page is what they call it. So there are some good things, but I also want to talk about, okay, so they want to ban it because they're saying there's some big national security issues, because if the Chinese government has access to a bunch of Americans' data, that is scary. That is scary. I 100% understand that. Okay, so it's scary, but is it scary enough for the government to get involved and ban it, or are there maybe some constitutional issues? So right now,
like First Amendment and stuff.
First Amendment, and there's another one that's not as apparent that I'll talk about after we get to the free speech one. But yes, absolutely. So the Court of Appeals in D.C., they just ruled, because people were fighting back that this is anti-free speech, and they were challenging it legally. And this court ruled that actually it wasn't violating Americans' free speech. So no, the ban could continue. But the government isn't just allowed to say, nope, we've examined it, we don't think so. They have to give proof as to why this is absolutely necessary and necessary enough where we can ban the free exchange of information and expression. And they didn't really do that in this court case. So there's a lot still that we need to discuss, because I think you and I, Rachel, we can look at this and say this is absolutely an issue of freedom of expression and freedom of sharing information, which all wraps into the First Amendment. So there's a lot going on here. There's another thing, and this is, to me, the more interesting constitutional problem with this. We do have a right, so under the 14th Amendment, you actually have the right to economic liberty. That is something, it's harder to fight. The Supreme Court doesn't like taking up these cases. It all goes back to this landmark decision in a bunch of cases called the Slaughterhouse ruling. And after that, that's some homework assignment for you. We'll go into that another time. But the Supreme Court doesn't like to touch it. It's kind of a taboo issue. So what does TikTok have to do with economic liberty? I will tell you. How many entrepreneurs are now making their living? And yes, I'm calling them entrepreneurs. How many of these influencers are now making their living because of TikTok videos?
Because they're making content that they get paid for by view.
That they get paid for by view, and people sponsor them. And so this whole new TikTok economy has exploded. And, as somebody who really likes the entrepreneurial, I love that spirit. I think that's great. Whether or not, obviously, like I said, I think there's some real concerns with TikTok. I think the people who are worried have every right to be. But also, I think it's really cool seeing people make content about things they love that maybe they wouldn't be able to earn a living for, outside of that. Like people who are doing makeup tutorials, people who've become like actors and singers and comedians because people have seen them on TikTok.
And dancers.
I mean, it's so cool to me to see this big, burgeoning field of entrepreneurs. And yes, some of them are silly and all they do is dance. And you're like, what? But they're hustling. I love that they're out there, because making content is not easy. I tried to do TikTok once for an organization, and it took like days for a video when you have to get the editing and everything. But sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, I wanted to ask you a practical question about TikTok. When you say that you learned a lot about, say, bread making, did you actually search for those videos? Like actively you put it in a search bar, you want to learn how to plumb something?
Yeah, so I would say like how to, sourdough making, but then it saw that I like sourdough, and it would throw in every now and then, it would throw in a random recipe, maybe another baked good.
So I guess my question is then, like a child, maybe a 7-year-old, maybe even younger, who is looking at TikTok and they don't know what to search for, or they don't think to search for anything. The algorithm just feeds them stuff. I think maybe that's a concern. What is it feeding, and how is it making those decisions? I think that's what people are nervous about.
That too, but I would ask you this as a parent. Would you let, your 7-year-old have a TikTok account that's just theirs? Or would you, because if it's yours and you're letting your kids look through it, that would have your likes too. There wouldn't be separate. And on that note, and I don't know this, I'm opening this to an open question. Do you let 7-year-olds have their own phone and look through TikTok? But is it the government's job to intervene and ban it? Or maybe should parents who are concerned not let their kids have it? So there's a lot of these moving parts. And I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Well, just for me, like what we've decided as a family, like we didn't let our kids have a phone. Parker, my older son, got his first phone when he was 13.
Okay.
And that was a big deal. And we have completely banned TikTok in this house because I just heard too many things about that algorithm and it makes me nervous. I don't know what he's being served up or what he might search for
Yeah.
as a 13-year-old boy. So, yeah, we don't do TikTok. Now they do watch YouTube and I'm not sure that that's better, honestly, but
yeah. But you can see the computer. I feel like it's so much scarier on the phone because, YouTube, you can also see the account on a computer or even on your TV and you can see search histories and you can at least keep an eye. But that TikTok account on one person's phone, on a teenager's phone, is so personal to them. I think it's probably a little harder to monitor too.
Well, and also not using TikTok myself, I'm a little bit more nervous. Now, probably if I use TikTok as much as you do, I would be more comfortable.
Even then, and again, I say this, I am not a parent. I was a teacher, so I love working with kids. I have a billion nieces and nephews. But as somebody who is not a parent, I think it's very easy for me to say like, oh, well, if I was a parent, and I think that's, I want to give that disclaimer. But
everybody does things a little bit different.
Everybody does things a little bit differently. Because in my mind, I like to think I'd be like, oh, well, they wouldn't have social media at all. And I wouldn't let them have phones at all. And then I think about being a kid. And for me, it wasn't until I was 16, 17 that everyone I knew had a cell phone and I had one as well. But I paid for it. I had a job, and the world is very different now. We didn't really have social media. We had MySpace, which was very different.
I remember MySpace.
It was a whole thing. So it's definitely a different world that we live in now. I do think it's important for parents and not the government to take over monitoring what their kids are doing. But since we are running short on time, I do want to kind of wrap it all together in a pretty little bow for you guys. So this ban may or may not happen. It's supposed to happen in 2 days, I think. But some other things are happening too. Trump is going to get back into office. He'll be inaugurated. He said he's willing to maybe talk about not banning TikTok. So that's one thing that could happen. But remember,
they already passed a law.
Exactly.
So Congress.
Constitutionally, he has to obey that. So whatever that means, we hope, because if he did go back and try to veto it at this point, I think there'd be a whole battle there, as there should be. We got to keep people in their lanes. But I think what's likely to happen is all these lawsuits are coming up. And so I mentioned the word injunction earlier, where if there's a lawsuit happening and the issue isn't resolved, they still need to talk about it. They'll basically say, pause, we're not going to ban it yet. We're going to get together and we're going to talk about it. It's like when your parents say, like, you ask if you can go to a friend's birthday party and they say, maybe, but I need to discuss it with your dad or something. And then they have to discuss it. That's basically what it is. So they're going to go discuss it. And you're over here, you're like, okay, but I can still maybe go. They haven't said no yet. That's kind of what's happening. So by the time you listen to this, you might have the answers. But right now it's really interesting. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because all these different angles. Sometimes there isn't one like, oh, yes, it's absolutely this or it's absolutely that. And with TikTok in particular, there's all these different things like, real issues with data and privacy. Oh my goodness, so many problems. But then you look at the entrepreneurs who've been able to succeed and pay for their well-being through this. And that's great. Free speech. That's great. But then, kids looking at it, teenagers looking at it. Whose role is it? The parents or the government? And so there's all these different things. And so as we're looking at the story and whatever has happened by the time you're listening, really keep in mind all these different factors at play and what do you think about it? There's so many different moving parts. So we'll leave it there. But I think this is a really interesting topic. I'm excited to see how this pans out. But so thank you for listening. Oh, Rachel,
I have one comment on the Constitution, though, because this brings up a lot of constitutional issues about freedom of speech, like you mentioned. I heard a discussion earlier today about this and constitutional rights and how the Chinese government does not have the constitutional rights afforded to American citizens. And it reminded me of something very important that I learned in Ron Paul's office. Learned a lot about the Constitution in Ron Paul's office, but the Constitution does not grant rights to people. The Constitution restrains the U.S. government wherever it is acting and whoever it is acting against. So it's an important thing to think about. And I guess there's different interpretations. Obviously, some people think that the Constitution applies to American citizens and it grants them rights. But I don't think that's true. I think the government is restrained by the Constitution. So that's just another topic for discussion.
Yep. The positive rights versus negative rights. We've talked about that in
our
old
that
podcast, so we'll have to bring that up again. Awesome. Yeah. Well, you guys don't forget to like and subscribe and share this podcast with other friends and family. And until next time, we'll talk to you later.
All right. See you next time.